Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Hi, Dick. You're the only brave one with the camera. And Michael.
It would be great if everybody turned their camera on.
So we're gonna let people make their choices when they feel comfortable because we are recording this session. We'll do some editing so that I have requested that this session be recorded, but I guess they just turn it on automatically. We'll just cut off the
Beginning.
initial start. Michael, I think you should be able to share your screen. Would you mind checking that out for me?
Yep.
Beautiful. So we're all set for that. I think we would let people slowly trickle in and maybe begin at 11:04-ish, depending on how many people we have. Shouldn't be too long. For those of you who are joining, if you don't mind putting your name, I think I see most people have identified themselves by name on the Zoom. So your name and the village you are associated with, just put it in the chat. Hello, Doug. Hello, Dana. Joe, Jean, Fran. Good to see you all. Nice to see you, Emily. First time I'm seeing you. Caroline. Caroline, are you with North Chevy Chase Connection?
No, I'm with Silver Spring.
Spring, okay. So Michael, Anne is not going to be with us today. I'm going to do the introduction solo, I think.
Right.
I find as I go into the chat, I cannot send a message to everyone and I can't change the everyone to just you.
Yeah, I'm having the same problem.
Okay, the person that had set up this Zoom link for me is non-responsive this morning. I'm guessing is somewhere else. So that's actually an issue because we were going to allow the chat function to be used for Q&A. Let me see if there's another way we can do Q&A.
You can send to the whole group, just not an individual.
You can send to the whole
Oh,
group?
I can't send to a whole group.
I cannot.
Oh, no, you're right. It blocked it.
Yep. All right. So this is not good. Give me a second. I'm gonna get offline for a second and try to ping that person through Teams.
Have a seat. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right.
We're gonna start in just a few minutes. I'm having a little technical challenge with the chat function. I'll be back in a minute,
Okay.
although I think we might need to deal with it. Okay, it seems as though the person that have set up this Zoom link for us is not available. We're gonna have to just deal with non-existent chat. So what we're gonna do is you're gonna raise your hands and I will try to moderate the question. So Michael, if you want to just tell me if you prefer to hold questions all the way to the end, or if you want me to just interrupt you as I see hands come up.
Yeah, I think you can interrupt as you see hands come up.
Okay, we'll do that. I apologize. Would you like to begin?
Sure.
Right.
Well, welcome everyone. This is round 2. Let's make sure that we can get our. There we go. Talking about board governance for villages in Montgomery County, and so this is a project that Capacity Partners has done with PAZI, Montgomery County Village Coordinator, and RAVE. Just a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. I have served on, I think, 7 boards at this point, as board member, committee chair, board chair for both local and national organizations. I've spent 16 years as a senior professional leader of nonprofit organizations, 15 years at the JCC in Rockville, and a year as an interim CEO of a small education nonprofit. I have a certificate in board consulting from BoardSource, which is the leader in nonprofit governance, and I'm really excited we get to do this again. So today, this is our agenda. We're going to talk about 4 main topics. It's a lot to cover in 2 hours, and so this is going to be an overview. You all received a governance overview from PAZI that has the detail that you won't see on the slides, but has the detail of what I'm talking about today. And my goal is really to share leading practices in board governance and plant some seeds for you to think about how they might help your boards function better. And lastly, this is an opportunity for you all to learn from each other as well. I have noticed that there are a lot of common issues across village boards. And after today's session, those of you who want to do a one-on-one session for your board with me can schedule that directly with me. And I would put my email in the chat, but we can't do that. So it is michael@capacitypartners.com. And PAZI will send that out after the meeting as well. Okay, so let's start. We're going to talk about first the qualities that drive village success. Then we're going to talk about the different stages that your board may be in. We're going to speak about the difference between governance and management, and then focus on how to build an effective board. So the first quality of that helps drive village success, and what I'll say up front is that these qualities don't guarantee success, but that all successful nonprofits exhibit these qualities. So the first one is that your board is well-informed, passionate, and engaged. And so well-informed means that the board understands the role you meet in the community. It understands the role of the board and the board members, and everyone knows why they're serving on the board. Passionate means that the village as an organization, the board is passionate about its mission and the constituents that you serve, and it's a top priority for board members. And an engaged board means that board members attend meetings, come prepared, ask questions, participate in village events, and advocate for the village. Second quality is a trust-based relationship between board members based on respect, candor, and open communications. That's what enables your board to have a robust conversation. The third quality would be to have a lead staff person, whether a volunteer or a paid ED, who is knowledgeable and passionate. And lastly, that same trust-based relationship that the board needs to have also needs to happen between the board chair in particular and the ED, as well as the board members and the ED. So let's talk a little bit about what gets in the way of this success. Since you can't write in the chat right now, why, if somebody has some thoughts as to what gets in the way of those relationships and that success, if you want to raise your hand, Physique can just call on you. We want to make this so you don't have to just hear my voice for 2 hours.
I'll raise my hand.
Sure, go ahead, Carolyn.
One of the things is the petty sensitivities that we have with respect to hearing things that are in disagreement with our position when we state it publicly. And it can be, sometimes it can be because you've stated it and you're feeling the feedback that your sensitivity is reflecting, or it could be that you refuse to put your position out on the table because you've already been in those situations when your position is not understood or not heard for what it is, an honest offering. So
that sounds like it directly addresses that question of a trust-based relationship based on respect and candor, open communication. Anybody else? Paula?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's just a lack of shared understanding, of shared expectations about what the village is, what its goals are, how we function as a group. It's not anything, I don't know, I just think a lack of shared and common expectations, I guess.
I think that's absolutely right. Connie, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say a lack of involvement, either coming to board meetings unprepared, not having read anything, or not doing anything else other than coming to board meetings, not going to events or whatever.
Yep.
Yes.
Board members who don't fulfill their responsibilities, we will talk about those. So here are some other thoughts that get in the way. One we just heard, right? There's no clear direction, right? Sometimes village boards focus only on the operations of the village and not on the strategy and the long-term planning. Secondly, often there's no new blood. So if a founder of a village doesn't let go, doesn't delegate, or if there are no term limits or really a good recruiting plan, then people burn out and there's nobody prepared to replace them. Third would be uninformed board members, right? If you don't prepare for board meetings, then you're not going to be informed as to what's going on. If you don't have an orientation session for board members, then they don't understand what's expected of them. Fourth would be unproductive or distracting board members, right? Board members who behave badly, but we don't find a way to remove them from the board. Fifth would be committees that don't function well, or an executive committee that makes all the decisions instead of having decisions made by the board. And lastly would be not having a real business model. It's really hard to rely solely on volunteers for everything and have no revenue. In order to be sustainable over the long term, having some revenue is a much better way of guaranteeing success. So let's talk about some of the different stages that boards might be in, and how those different stages connect to the difference between governance, management, and operations. My goal here is to come up with some shared language for how we talk about these things. So on a continuum, right, we start with boards that are founding boards. And while boards evolve over time, there's no right or wrong. It's just a process that boards go through. And to the extent that boards move up this pyramid that we're going to see, the more likely they will be sustainable. So founding boards require lots of time, as you know, and work from board members and focus more on day-to-day. Usually there's no staff. So how many of you would you say, are founding boards at this point? Well, at least nobody whose camera is on is raising their hand. Working boards would be the next stage, right? So this requires board members who are both willing to work, but the focus shifts to planning. Operations are typically handled by volunteers, and sometimes there's paid staff to do specific tasks, could be web or communications, things like that. And then there are working committees as well. Any of you with your cameras on consider yourselves working boards? Yes, I see some nods. Great. Next would be a managing board. This requires board members that have more planning skills, and the focus shifts to governance and annual and strategic planning. Committees are working, and often there is now a paid executive director and possibly some other paid staff. So I see Doug here, so I know there are some boards here that have would have at least a managing board. And then lastly would be a governing board. This is where the directors need to have policy and planning skills, and the focus is more on governance and strategic planning, not running the day-to-day. The board is focused on oversight and policy, and the executive director and staff are focused on operations and executing the strategic plan. So as we go up that ladder to think about what the governance principles are that frame board operations, there's really four, right? Understanding that the board provides a meaningful and rewarding opportunity to guide a mission-based organization and have a positive impact on your community. That another governance principle is focusing on mission, vision, and strategic issues. The board doesn't focus on daily operations. A third is that there's an understanding of the collective role of the board and the role of individual board members. And finally, the board hires the chief executive, which could be an executive director, and that person hires the staff. And that's really what separates governance from management. I want to talk a little bit more about this to really hopefully make a clear distinction between the work of the board and the work involved in running your village. So let's just start with governance. Right, so governance is about mission and vision and translating mission and vision into strategy and policy. Mission and vision are developed cooperatively between the board and the staff, and ultimately the authority for that rests with the board. Management is about making decisions needed to implement strategy and policy. So the staff might seek advice of individual board members based on expertise, but the staff is responsible for management. And lastly is operations, which are about implementing the managerial decisions. So staff, again, may seek advice from individual board members, but this is a staff function. So how many of you are board chairs? Quite a few. Great. How many of you who are board chairs are also filling the role of the executive director? Like you don't have a paid executive director. Is anybody doing that as well? No. Okay, this is a very different group than those who showed up in person. So I think the important piece here is that when a board member is filling a staff role, right, which can be being a volunteer, which is can be an unpaid staff person, remembering that just because a board member is filling a role doesn't mean it's a board issue when there's a question that comes up.
Michael, can I interrupt just 1 second?
Yeah.
For the benefit of those who have joined us later than when we had begun, our chat function is disabled. Therefore, if you wish to make a comment or ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you so that you can participate. Thank you.
Great. And if you want to turn your cameras on, we encourage that. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we separate governance and operations. And this is more for what I would call a working board as opposed to a governing board. And this is a sample org chart that shows how one might separate governance from operations. So you can see here that the dark blue boxes are board committees, right? These are committees that are responsible for resources, sustaining the board and educating the board, and financial oversight. Those are governance functions. And then you will see that there's on the far left an operational oversight committee. So that typically would not be a committee, a board committee, but for working boards or founding boards, this is often the structure in order to make the operation go. And so the committees that fall under that are program, volunteer, and marketing communications as examples. And those could be filled by non-board members or board members. But the goal here is really to show how the board oversees an executive director, whether that position is a volunteer position or a paid position, which are governing committees and which are operational oversight committees. As we think about this, it might be helpful to think about what decisions are board decisions versus what decisions are staff decisions. So as I mentioned earlier, the key, particularly when there is an executive director, is the relationship between the board chair and the executive director. And I would say overall in nonprofit governance, that is the most important relationship that there is. And we would call that a constructive partnership. And in that partnership, the board makes decisions that are focused on governance and policy. And the executive director provides some insight into the daily, how those decisions affect the operation of the organization. And the executive makes decisions about management and operations, and board members may provide insight. And where things get really kind of hairy is in the middle, in the partnership area. And those are the shared decisions between the board and the executive director, right? And so those shared decisions are often around financial stewardship, fundraising, succession planning, strategic planning, and program evaluation. And because those fall in the middle is why that relationship between the board chair and the executive director is critical, because we don't want boards that micromanage the executive director, and we don't want executive directors that macro govern the board, right? It's looking at understanding whose role belongs to whom and how we share those things that fall in the middle. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about building an effective board. And I think some of the issues that came up earlier, we'll talk a little bit about here. So the foundation for an effective board is built on 4 elements: job descriptions for both the board and board members, board vitality, which includes recruitment, orientation, and succession planning, board operations, which involve the annual calendar, board meetings and committees, and assessment of the board, board members, and the executive director. And we're going to go into depth in each one of these areas. So let's talk about the board's job description, right? The board has 3 basic responsibilities: setting organization identity and direction, ensuring necessary resources for your village, and providing oversight. So when we talk about setting direction and organizational identity, we're talking about the first piece being mission, right? The board is involved in defining the mission, why you exist, and the need you meet in the community. Establishing vision, which is your aspiration, what the future would look like if you were successful in fulfilling your mission. Values, defining your core values, which are the deeply held beliefs that guide your programs and operations. And lastly, deciding on strategy, the roadmap of goals and actions to fulfill your mission and achieve your vision priorities. Those are the responsibilities of the board, and many of which are working hand in hand with the executive director in setting organizational identity and direction, which is the first key job of the board. The second is ensuring necessary resources. So that involves human, financial, and reputational resources. Hiring or selecting, if it's a volunteer, overseeing and supporting the chief executive, ensuring that you have adequate financial resources and that the board meets its fundraising responsibilities, ensuring the presence of a capable and responsible board, protecting the goodwill and assets of the organization, and enhancing public standing by being able to clearly articulate the mission, accomplishments, and goals of the village and seeking support from the community. So the second big job function of the board is ensuring that you have the resources to operate your village. The third major area is in providing oversight. This involves a number of elements. First is ensuring effective use of resources. That's financial oversight. The second is monitoring and evaluating programs and services. Do you measure the impact of your programs? Do you know that they're having the intended effect for your community that you want them to? Third would be measuring progress against a strategic plan, or maybe an annual plan if you're not up to strategic planning. Are you tracking whether or not your actual results are meeting your planned results? Fourth would be evaluating the chief executive or the executive director, whether that person's a professional or a volunteer. Evaluating how that person fills that role is an important responsibility of the board. Evaluating the board itself, at least biannually, doing an assessment of how well the board is doing at fulfilling its responsibilities. Planning for succession, we're going to talk in more depth about in a little while. And providing legal and ethical oversight and maintaining accountability, which we're about to discuss. So oversight, providing oversight is the third main job of the board. So in terms of legal and ethical oversight, in 2002, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act became law. And while this was passed in response to corporate accounting scandals such as Enron and applies mainly to publicly traded companies, there are two parts of it that do apply to nonprofits. One is having a whistleblower policy. So that is a policy in which if somebody sees that there is wrongdoing happening at your nonprofit and reports it, there can be no retaliation against that person. The second is having a document retention and destruction policy. So many organizations have a document retention policy in general for maintaining financial records. But this retention and destruction policy really deals with making sure that if there's an investigation or a lawsuit against your organization, that you can know it prohibits altering or destroying documents that might be relevant to that proceeding. So those are the main responsibilities of the board. So let's talk a little bit about board member responsibilities. This is the job of a board member. So they fall into, I would say, two broad categories. First is, what is their role as a board member? So as a board member, there are fiduciary responsibilities, which we will talk about in a little bit. The board members have a role as a strategic thinker, right? Providing input and participating and setting direction for the organization. Board members have a role to sit on a committee. That should be part of their responsibility. And board members should be an ambassador and an advocate for your village in the community and enhance your village's public standing. In order to do that, they need to be well informed about what you actually do and understand the impact you have in the community. And lastly, a board member's role as a board member is being a donor and a fundraiser, right? That is participating in your fundraising plan. And there are many opportunities besides soliciting a gift that would fulfill that role in terms of being a fundraiser. You also have non-board roles, right? So a non-board role is being a volunteer or unpaid staff member and also being an expert advisor. Many boards bring people onto the board because of their legal expertise or financial expertise. And when staff reaches out to access that expertise, they're not acting in the role of a board member, but they're acting in the role of a pro bono expert advisor. So board members wear many different hats, some as board members, some as non-board members. Board members may also be participants in your programs. And so it's really important that board members recognize what hat they're wearing when they come to the executive director with a particular request, because we're not always acting in the role of a board member. So let's talk about board member fiduciary duties. First off, a fiduciary is someone who acts on behalf of another based on expectation of trust. So board members have three fiduciary duties. We call them the 3 Ds: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. These are legal responsibilities of the board as a whole, as well as individual board members that you must adhere to. And they are the legal standards by which actions taken by directors and the board are judged. And you demonstrate accountability to these 3 fiduciary duties by showing that you have effectively discharged them. So how do you do that? So the duty of care means that board members exercise good judgment and sound oversight, and they act in good faith, stay informed, and ask questions. So this is about participation, right? That board members prepare for and attend board and committee meetings, that they pay attention to the organization's activities and operations, that they use common sense and exercise independent judgment, that board members review finances and financial policies, and that you keep minutes of board and committee meetings. So that is how you show that you are fulfilling the duty of care. Questions before I move on? Okay, duty of loyalty means that you act solely in your village's best interest and not with your own self-interest or the interest of any entity in which you have a formal relationship, right? We are avoiding conflicts of interest here. The way you show that you are fulfilling this is by having a conflict of interest policy and by board members disclosing any conflicts that they might have. And making sure that you avoid using your role for personal gain or benefit. And lastly, by maintaining confidentiality. So there are many conflicts that are potential, but they aren't necessarily illegal. It's very common for there to be conflicts. And what's important is that board members report the conflicts, that they resolve them, or if they can't be resolved, they recuse themselves from voting on an issue in which they have a conflict. And a conflict could be either a financial conflict or it could be a communal conflict. So if a board member serves on another board of an organization that might impact a decision that your board is making, that could be a potential communal conflict. Questions about loyalty? Lastly is the duty of obedience, and that is making sure that you comply with the laws, follow the bylaws and policies, and be a guardian of your mission, right? You must ensure that federal, state, and local laws and reporting requirements are followed. That would be like filing your 990 tab, and examining your bylaws and policies, and making sure the decisions you make fall within the scope of your bylaws, your mission, and any other governing documents. If you have paid staff, it's important to remember that board members can be held liable if you fail to pay payroll taxes, and you cannot be indemnified against failing to pay payroll taxes. So a breach of duty is not necessarily covered by D&O insurance. So these are the 3 Ds that are individual and collective responsibilities of the board and board members. And since we're talking about your legal responsibilities, we should talk a little bit about how you protect the organization and both for the village itself as well as the board. So first, there are legal protections. There's volunteer protection from both the Maryland Volunteer Service Act and the Federal Volunteer Protection Act. And they provide some level of protection for individual unpaid volunteers. They do not protect against egregious behavior, and they do not protect the board. The second way of protecting the village board members is indemnification of directors, right, and having D&O insurance. So your bylaws might typically indemnify your directors, and you should maintain D&O insurance. Lastly, there are certain key areas of focus for protection. One is recognizing that most lawsuits revolve around employment actions of an employee. And so being aware of employment practices and following proper policies is really important. We just spoke about the 3 Ds. In terms of financial activity, making sure that you have a strong finance committee is an important way of protecting the board. Business operations, having written contracts for large purchases helps protect the board. Fundraising, making sure that if you are fundraising, that you have policies for gift acceptance. And volunteers, making sure that your general liability insurance covers volunteers. So if you're running an event and a volunteer gets hurt, that your general liability, not a D&O policy, would be important to have to cover that. So as a summary of board and board member responsibilities, it's important to remember that board members have to fulfill the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience, that you are all ambassadors for the organization and you represent it externally. And lastly, you are volunteers for the organization and when you're participating in activities that are not board activities. So there's a difference between when you're acting as the board member and when you're acting as a volunteer. So before we go on to the next topic, any questions about any of that? Yep, Fran?
So this is all very wonderful because I missed the in-person meeting. I see how this information, which is wonderful, pertains really nicely to a village board. And by that I mean is you've got the board and then you've got, you know, it's a board specifically developed to oversee a village. But what about a board that it oversees like 10 different programs? I mean, really, really different programs, one of which is a village, but others are things that don't look like anything like a village. They might be like a concert or a fun run, or they're all run by different people. And
But
they
they're
all
all-
have,
But they're all part of the village program?
no, they have nothing to do with the village program. So the only thing we have in common is the board. And the board was developed because we're all operating under a board foundation. And this kind of happened sort of like an afterthought. You know, we started without that relationship. And then we said, well, probably would be easy if we did this because we could take advantage of the insurance and the 501c3 status and so on like that. But then over the years, it's gotten, I mean, I look at this and I like, wouldn't it be nice if that board would do a lot of these things?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about are there different responsibilities for a board that has a much broader set of responsibilities?
Well, I don't think there's a lot of difference in terms of the board's role, right? So many organizations have a wide variety of programs, right? So so if I take, for example, the JCC, where I was the CEO, we had a fitness center, we had a preschool, we had a camp, we had seniors programs, we had arts programs, we had lots of different programs. The board was responsible for overseeing the organization and the staff was responsible for overseeing the different program areas, right? So I think that is similar in recognizing that the board needs to set the direction that encompasses how all of those things fit together. So one might question whether there's been what's called mission creep for your village board, right? In other words, have you gone beyond what you were really founded to do? And does it make sense to have all of those things? And if it does, well, then that's fine. The board makes the decision on how they all interconnect. But the board doesn't necessarily run all those programs. They're setting the parameters for how those programs are, you know, how we're going to hire staff to run those different programs. So it's not uncommon to have lots of different programs under one board. The question is the board fulfilling its governance responsibility of setting direction, ensuring resources, and providing oversight while there is staff running those different things? And does it make sense for you to be doing all of those different things? Hope that helps a little bit.
I think it does, because I think we need to decide whether the board can be more of a board for us and not compromise the work it's doing with all the others. I think there's a lot of retrofitting right now. The board is basically saying we want to do more, and a lot of these programs have been around before that relationship between board and programs happened.
Yeah.
So they're kind of there's a sort of a funny kind of relationship going on. But yeah, I think we just need to
I'd be not trying
decide.
to take that offline and talk a little bit after this.
I think that would make good sense, Michael. Thank you. We were planning on doing that with you.
No problem.
Okay, enough said.
Michael, this is Barbara Wiss. I have a question.
Sure.
I'm new to the world of nonprofits and being on a board.
Welcome.
And I have, it's been exciting and quite a learning experience. But I have development responsibilities, and I don't know what fundraising policies mean.
Okay, so fundraising policies might involve what types of gifts you will accept. So for some organizations, right, and particularly those that have a facility, somebody might donate a piece of artwork, right? Or if you're not looking at something physical and they're donating money, they might say they want to make a donation to do a particular program, and that might not be a program that you do. And you have to make a decision whether you would accept that gift in order to do that program. So policies around what kinds of gifts you'll accept, whether you will accept a directed gift or whether you only want a gift to support the general unrestricted operations of the village, would be that type of policy. You might also have policies around the responsibilities of board members to participate in the fundraising activity, right? Are board members supposed to be donors? Are board members supposed to help you in planning fundraising events or other fundraising activities? So those would be policies as well. So there's more of this in the overview that you received, which kind of goes hand in hand with this presentation.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Michael, question for Michael.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, I was a member I and several other people I knew were members of a board, were members of two boards, two separate organizations that had a lot of things in common. And whenever something would come up which fit in the commonality area, a lot of us were accused of a conflict of interest because of the commonality area. And we always saw it as a confluence of interest. Can you speak to that?
What do you want to give me a little bit more specific example between the two organizations?
They were two professional organizations.
Uh-huh.
And some of the things that wanted to be done might have wanted to be done as a joint project. And in both organizations, there was a faction that didn't want to do anything joint, and there was a faction that did. Obviously, the people that were members in both sides wanted to do it. And so the faction that didn't want to do the joint would say, you guys have conflicts of interest, you can't vote. And we would say, no, we have a confluence of interest. We, of course, should vote.
Well, I think the ultimate question becomes, was the decision at hand focused on putting your one organization at a disadvantage compared to the other organization, right? And so when you're on two boards trying to make decisions together, I think you do put yourself in a slightly challenging position to say that because you can't say that you're operating only in the best interest of one organization, and you're assuming that your position that it's in the best interest of both organizations is your opinion. So I might argue that while there may have been opportunities to partner, maybe that would be an operational decision because there were economies of scale, or maybe the board members who were not on both boards should be making those decisions.
If I may add, I think that this example does not demonstrate conflict of interest in the sense that no one was really standing to personally gain, or as you've said, no one organization was going to either benefit or gain. It was simply a matter of philosophical disagreements between two factions, as you call them, of the boards. And that's a completely legitimate kind of conversations to have within boards without having anyone being asked to recuse themselves of a decision on which they have an opinion, which is perfectly legitimate.
Yeah, I would just say that when you're on both boards, it makes it a little bit difficult to say that you are giving loyalty to one organization versus another.
That was not the case. These were just two villages who.
And he was talking about a professional association. He was talking about something different, I think.
No, I believe there's two different villages that ended up being merged.
Ah, okay. I thought that the question was a different question about people who are on two different professional associations.
Yes, well, my question had to do with two professionals organizations, but obviously there was a parallel situation going on. This thing couldn't have been just unique to our thing. It happens all the time.
Organizations partner all the time. I think the question is when you have board members that overlap between the two organizations, how you handle those situations, right? Having two organizations, having two boards talking about how they're going to partner or merge, that's totally fine because you have board members who are on each or part of each organization. But when board members are part of both organizations, the question becomes how you make the distinction as to who you're showing loyalty to.
That's it. That's the general question.
Yeah.
And it came down in our group as those that were for had a conflict of interest, and those that were opposed had claimed it was a confluence of interest.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about board vitality. So there are three elements to board vitality. One is, how do we recruit board members? Two is, how do we orient them and get them on board? And three is, how do we focus on succession planning? These seem to be the areas that I'm finding most boards are having the most challenge with. So let's first talk about recruiting prospective board members. And I'll start by suggesting that your village should have a governance committee. Sometimes it's called a nominating committee, but I think having nominations be part of a governance committee is a broader and better use of the committee. And so in recruiting board members, the goal is, how do we get the right people on our board, and how do we build a leadership pipeline? And so it needs to start with a job description and expectations for board members. So how many of you have written job descriptions for your board members? Some. So that's great. So that's critical, right? That board members have a written job description and know what is expected of them. Second is looking for board members who meet the needs of the village. So you need board members with the skills based on where you might be in your strategic plan or your stage of development, whether you're a founding, working, managing, or governing board. And lastly, having board members who bring a diversity of background, skills, and perspective. Our boards should reflect the communities we serve, and having a diverse board generally makes for better decision-making. So in the appendix to the overview that you received, you will find some samples for how to look at these issues. So there is a board candidate / board member background and skills worksheet. And there is also a composite board matrix that looks at all of how those skills apply to all of the members of your current board. And the goal is to understand the skills and background of your current board members, think about what you need on your board in order to identify the gaps between where you are and what you need, and then focus your recruitment on filling those gaps. And the templates that are in the appendix can be modified to your particular board's needs. Yep, Connie?
This may seem like an obvious thing, but how do you define the community you serve? Is that your current members and volunteers? Is it your larger community? Is it your potential community for members? I mean,
yeah, so you're sort of serving a geographic area, right? Some villages are focused on trying to be intergenerational in how they engage the community. So I would think that you would want board members from your geographic area, and you would want intergenerational board members, right? If you're trying to engage the whole community, you might want a broad set of backgrounds and skills and ages and gender and whatnot that kind of reflects your community. So this first part is about, well, how do we identify, what kind of skills we need to have on our board? And the next part is about, well, how do we identify particular board members or board candidates for our board? And I want to suggest two best practices. One is thinking about time frame, right? Many boards have a seasonality to their nominating process and their board election. But I would like to suggest that recruiting for your board is a year-round activity, and always being on the lookout for prospective board members is something to focus on. Where do you find your board members now?
well, we just in Silver Spring decided we had a few too many board members who had not already been involved in the village, and we decided to take a really good look at every single member, volunteer, and donor for potential, and we came up with quite a few people that have great potential.
That's great.
But we'll need to look out again, and we'll have to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, so and should be an ongoing process, right? Looking for people who are connected to your mission, who are familiar with your programs and services. If we think about our stakeholders as prospective board members, right? Our stakeholders are those who care most deeply about our village, right? They are volunteers, they might be donors, they may be non-board members who served on a committee, they may be participants at your programs, and they may just be somebody in the community. Those are all of your stakeholders who can potentially be board members. Others who might potentially be other ways of recruiting potential board members would be asking current board members who they know that might be a good potential board member, asking your executive director who they know. Services-Montgomery runs a program called Board Match for retiring leaders who are interested in getting involved in nonprofits, and could be an excellent source of potential board members. There are board members of other nonprofits who might be a potential board member for your village. So looking at other organizations that provide similar services and seeing who's on their board by checking their website might be a way of identifying potential board members. And even small business owners in your community could be potential board members. So starting to think about that broad pool of board members is a great way to identify candidates. And then the question is, how do we cultivate potential board members? What should we do before they come on the board, and how do we assess them? So I think it's a challenge, and I think Connie was referring to this, like bringing somebody who you've never worked with before onto your board is not necessarily the best way to effectively identify a good board candidate. So having people who you invite to your programs or serve on a committee as a non-board member or act as a volunteer are great ways to start to cultivate board members. And as you think they may be a candidate for a board position, having an information sheet that's in the appendix where you can start to understand, where they are and how they would, with their background, age, gender, profession or former profession or expertise, right? How does that fill a gap on your board? And really assess it from that perspective as you work with somebody, understanding whether they will fulfill a need, if their personality is suitable for your board. Are they prepared to make the commitment that you want from your board members? Are they going to be willing to be an ambassador for the village? Will they make the village a philanthropic priority? Will they support the village financially? And lastly, I would suggest that interviewing potential board members would be a great practice, right? Really having a conversation with them about the expectations. So often we are recruiting a board member and we'll start off with, it's not going to take that much time. There won't be any problem. You can do this, because we're desperate for a board member. But then you're going to get a board member who expects not to give you much time and not to be very interested. And if you're honest about the time that the time commitment you expect in terms of attending board meetings and participating on committees and attending events, about the skills you hope to them to bring to the board, and about their fundraising expectation in terms of being a supporter, you will get a board member who knows exactly what you want them to do. So be clear about the commitment and confirm that they understand and are willing to fulfill that commitment. It's okay to even have a job description that outlines expectations for board members and have that board member sign that job description and commitment so that it's clear that they are making a strong commitment to what you expect. So let's say you found some good candidates for your board and they're willing to serve on your board and bring their time, talent, and treasure to your organization. Now the question is, how do we orient them? How do we onboard them in an effective way? Do any of you have a formal orientation process for new board members? I see a couple of nods, but not many. So the goals of an orientation process are for a new board member to understand their role, to learn about the village, to learn who's who on the board and on the staff, and for them to feel really good about the fact that they joined your board. Let's face it, you only get one chance to make a first impression. So having a real orientation is critical to getting a board member on the board and started correctly. So the ideal would be to schedule your orientation before your board year starts. It should involve your board chair, your governance chair, your ED if you have one, and really focus on recent accomplishments, the strategic direction that you have, the finances of the village, fundraising responsibilities and board roles. And you can even invite board members who've been on the board for a while as a refresher to learn, to remind them about all of these things at an orientation session. In the appendix, there's an outline of what should be in an orientation session. And then it's also a perfect time to give them a board manual, right? And there's also a sample table of contents in the overview that you have, right? So having a board manual that has all of the key documents that they need and expectations would be really terrific. And lastly, consider a mentor program. If you assign a current board member to be a mentor for a new board member, it really gives you an opportunity to smooth that onboarding process. Having the mentor attend the orientation with the new board member, have them talk to each other between board meetings, having somebody who can answer questions about historical discussions that come up, but or have come up in prior years, but a new board member might not know what all the background is. Mentors could be a really effective way for both the new board, engaging the new board member and keeping your current board members engaged. Questions about orientation? Yeah, Paula. Please turn your microphone on, Paula. Paula, turn on your microphone. There
Sorry.
No problem.
Right, I had a phone call I had to take and I stepped out for a minute, so I apologize if I missed this. And I'll look at the recording later to catch up what I missed. But you mentioned having a board year, if I understood that right. In our village, we have sort of a, I don't know what to call it, a rolling, people's terms expire and we try to bring in somebody new, et cetera, et cetera. Could you talk about, and I think there's some value in not having a lot of turnover at the same time, but at the same time, I understand the concept of a board year as well and the advantages of that, having sort of a marker event or a marker month. Could you talk about that a little bit more, the pros and cons of that and how to manage it?
Well, we're going to talk about what a board calendar might look like in a couple of minutes. What I was focusing on was that you're recruiting of board members and vetting potential board members is really a year-round exercise, not to be focused just on, oh, it's a month before our annual meeting and we better find some new board members. That was, and we'll talk about what a board calendar might look like. And similarly, we need to talk about succession planning and term limits and planned and unplanned succession. So, the goal obviously is to have planned succession. Is there anyone on the call that doesn't have term limits for board members? Okay, well, that's good. Because term limits are what enable you to constantly bring on new perspectives and new blood to your board. And then in terms of planned and unplanned succession, we want to talk about the idea that, which we'll get into detail, is that that having people identify when they're not going to continue on the board makes for a much better transition than having people just drop off the board. So in terms of how this plays out, we'll go back for 1 second. In terms of planned succession, right? The goal is to set up your successors for success. And so thinking about how you build board leadership through when somebody gets onboarded through their term is really critical. And thinking about how somebody goes from being a board member to having an opportunity to chair a committee, to having an opportunity to be a board leader is a way of building your leadership pipeline, identifying potential successors a year in advance. So having a chair-elect position, or maybe even a committee chair-elect position, so that you're always planning on who is going to be the next person to fill a role is really important and makes the transition planning much better. And thinking about what skills you need for your board leaders as you move along would be helpful. Yes, Connie?
Well, when you ask about, I mean, ideally, it sounds great to know a year in advance who's going to move up, sort of. But what does that mean for your elections? So you have an election a year in advance?
Now, so often there's a position called chair-elect. Instead of vice president or vice chair, you actually elect a chair. You elect a chair, and some, you know, if your terms are 1 year or 2 years, you might just elect a chair-elect at the same time, so that that person knows that they will be the next board chair. And maybe 6 months beforehand, they start sitting in on meetings with the chair and the executive director, and they learn what they need to know to smoothly transition into that board chair role. Right? You could do that with a treasurer position or other positions as well. Having somebody identified well in advance makes that transition a lot easier. Another thing to think about is having your board chair and other board leaders maintain some sort of a journal of how they did certain things, so that that information can be transitioned to the next person, or keep a record of things that are not in the minutes, but were important considerations and decisions that were made. The more that you can provide the next person in a role, the smoother the transition becomes. And of course, there's always times where somebody, for whatever reason, drops out of a role in an unexpected way, and you have to deal with an unplanned transition. And that's an opportunity for the executive committee and the executive director to work together to figure out how to move forward. And at times when you can't find one person to fill a role on an emergency basis, you might consider shared leadership and having co-chairs or other roles where people can share responsibility on an interim basis until you can get back on track. So there is in the appendix of the overview that you have a sample succession planning worksheet where you can start to track different board members and when their terms are up, and start to think out in advance when somebody might be ready for a leadership role. And starting when somebody comes on the board and giving them responsibilities and seeing if they can be effective is a great way to build your pipeline from your current board. So let's talk a little bit about board operations. So I think there are 3 elements for effective board operations. One is annual board planning. A second is having engaging board meetings. And the third is thinking about how you use committees in a purposeful way. So let's talk about annual board planning first. Does anybody use an annual calendar for planning their year? I see a nod. Not many nods. So do you have board retreats every year? Anybody have a board retreat? No, I see maybe one hand. Okay, so let's talk about this because I think this is really a way of making sure that your board is on the same page. So annual board planning starts with setting board goals and key dates before the board year starts. When will the orientation be? Actually scheduling a board retreat, which might be a half a day or a full day, to really talk about the goals for your board for the coming year. Calendaring meeting topics, right? What should be the themes for board meetings in the coming year? Should there be a meeting where you're doing a review of your programs? Should there be meetings where you're doing board education about the community or about nonprofit trends or about what's happening at other organizations? Will you have internal presenters or will you invite other people to present to your board? And thinking about regular governance issues and calendaring them out in advance. So for example, when does the budget need to be approved? When are you going to report on last year's financials? Should there be a meeting where you are reporting on your fundraising goals and accomplishments? Does the strategic plan need to be reviewed? What's happening with board recruitment? Those are all governance topics that can be calendared through the year, and that way you can plan in advance for when you will address them at board meetings. The board retreat, which I mentioned before, is a great way to get everybody on the same page. And then thinking about committee charges or charters at the beginning of the year. And we'll talk more about committees in a little bit. Updating your board manual that we already talked about, and also creating a dashboard, like thinking about what your goals are for the year and how the board will monitor them, and then reporting on a regular basis to the board the results of those key goals. So let's talk a little bit about engaging board meetings. What makes a board meeting engaging for somebody? Connie, I see you smiling.
That's because I'm hoping ours are engaging, but I think it's a combination of having some structure, having some predictable things you do. Of course, you do the minutes and the financial reports, having speakers, allowing enough time for talking. I usually pack the agenda, and lately I've allowed more time for speaking, and I think we've had more, Doug would probably agree, we've had more engagement. And just allowing people to talk and not necessarily absolutely sticking to time deadlines.
So there are a number of things you can do to help ensure that your board meetings are engaging, right? So the first is to send out the agenda and the materials in advance, right? So that if people have 3 or 4 days to review it, they can come to the board meeting prepared. It would be helpful and a great practice if your agenda actually identified not only the topic, but what action is expected of the board. Is it going to be just a discussion, or is it going to be a vote? Is it a strategic issue, or is it a financial issue? And think about including in your agenda what I would call a mission moment, an opportunity for somebody to share an activity that was done by the village and the impact it had on the participants. Does anybody use a consent agenda as part of their agendas? So in the overview that you have, you'll see a full description of a consent agenda. But a consent agenda basically is an agenda item that incorporates committee minutes, the minutes from your last board meeting, any reports from committees that don't need to be discussed. And it saves you the time of having people read reports. If everything goes out in advance, then at that point in the agenda, the board chair says, you all reviewed the consent agenda. Does anybody have any objections? And if nobody has any objections, it becomes part of your record and you're done. You don't need to spend time reading reports. Having an opportunity during your board meetings to socialize, whether before or after the board meeting, is a great way to have an engaging board meeting. Providing some opportunity for board education around what you're trying to accomplish, and having strategic items on your agenda, not just, we're trying to raise this much money or we're struggling financially. Really having focusing on strategy, not just operations. And lastly, having evaluations of your board meetings. So you'll see in the appendix, I provided a very short board meeting evaluation. It's a great way to get feedback after board meetings to know how you might improve them. So after you've sent everything out in advance, it would be great if board members actually read it in advance, right? And came prepared and actually showed up at board meetings, right? Because those two things really make for an engaging board meeting if everybody knows what the issue is and they show up to talk about it. The fourth part of having an engaging board meeting is that the chair runs the meeting smoothly, right? That the meeting starts on time, that everybody turns off their cell phones or puts them on silent, that they feel that the board decisions are important and that the meeting ends on time. Lastly, you've had an engaging board meeting when you don't have to have a meeting after the meeting, right? How often do we walk out to our car and there are 3 board members rehashing everything that you just did in your board meeting, right? If we can talk about the issues at the board meeting, then maybe we can avoid the meeting after the meeting and actually have robust discussions because people trust each other and feel free to voice their opinions. So those are elements that make board meetings engaging. In terms of topics, I would say that a great way to think about board topics is thinking about what is highly important, but not necessarily urgent. And those tend to be strategic issues, right? Issues about direction, about priority, about choice of doing one thing or another thing. So to the extent that you're focused on strategic issues, makes for more meaningful board meetings, as opposed to urgent and unimportant things that just serve as a distraction, right? Clearly, if there's an emergency, you have to deal with it. And that would be highly urgent and highly important. But to the extent that your board agenda focuses on strategic issues, I think you have a much better opportunity to use the wisdom of the board to move the organization forward. So let's talk about committees. This is where the work of the board should really be focused, right, at the committee level. And then committees make recommendations for board action. So there are different types of committees. Some of you might have committees identified specifically in your bylaws as standing committees. You might have ad hoc committees, or task forces, which you create to address a particular issue. So if you're at the point of having creating a strategic plan, you might create a strategic planning committee or task force, and that committee is only going to exist for a certain specific period of time. It's really important that each year that you review the charter of your committees to make sure that they are, that everybody understands what the purpose of the committee is. And I wanted to mention that there is a trend to a different model of committees where there's basically in addition to the executive committee, there's only 3 committees. And for organizations that are having a hard time getting board members to participate in multiple committees, this alternative model might make sense. So there's a committee called an Internal Affairs Committee, in which all internal and operational issues related to finance, personnel, and risk management fall to that committee. Separately, there would be an External Affairs Committee that would focus on fundraising, communications, and marketing. And then there would be a Governance Committee that is focused on board recruitment, orientation, development, and assessment. Those would be the 3 committees in addition to the executive committee. And the last piece that I want to say about executive committees is simply to be careful how you use executive committees. They are great for setting the agenda for the year, or dealing with a sensitive or emerging issue and getting some feedback for the board chair. But it's really important to avoid pre-deciding issues that are really the board's issue to decide on, right? Having every issue come to the board that says the executive committee recommends this is not a way you're going to have an engaging board. Having the committee report and committee recommendations go to the board is fine, but don't have the executive committee pre-decide and create a rubber stamp board, because it's not going to be the way to have an engaged ongoing board. Committee size and makeup should vary based on the skills you need on a particular committee. And it's really important to set expectations for committees similar to the way you do for the board, right? How often is the committee going to meet? What's expected of committee members? What kind of reporting are you going to do? What are the attendance requirements? So being clear, like you are with new board members, about expectations for the board, to do the same thing with committee members is really important. And lastly, thinking about meetings, an engaging committee meeting follows very similarly to what an engaging board meeting looks like, right? So those rules for what makes for an engaging meeting applies to committees as well. Yeah, Connie.
I don't know where this fits in, but I have to leave a little bit early, so I'm going to ask it. That is, how often should boards meet? I mean, some people think, oh, you only need to meet quarterly or 6 times a month, 6 times a year. Some people think yearly. We meet about 10 times with occasional cancellations if we don't feel like there's things to talk about. But I mean, if you're going to have some continuity and engagement, wouldn't that argue for a 10 or 12 model versus a 6?
It's an interesting question. And I think it really varies partially by the stage your board is in. I think monthly meetings of the board dealing with governing issues tends to be a little much. I have a hard time imagining that there is enough to fill a monthly meeting. Boards that are founding boards or working boards are often dealing with operational issues. My suggestion might be that you alternate between a governing board meeting and an operational board meeting and separate those 2 issues completely. I've been on boards where we've met quarterly, where we've met every other month, and where we've met monthly. It's great to say we always meet on the the 3rd Thursday of every month or every other month or whatever that might be. It makes it really convenient. As a professional, you feel like you're doing nothing but preparing for meetings and responding to the meeting, and really hard to do the work that you're hired to do. I have found that that with boards, like every 6 weeks is not a bad time. It's, it can be a little bit easier than every month, and more engaging than every other month. So I think it depends on what your organization needs. The other advantage of meeting every other month is that it gives you the time in between for committees to meet. And so you're not putting as much on all your board members to meet, come to a board meeting, then come to a committee meeting and have everything happen all the time. And so you can alternate months between board meetings and committee meetings as an option as well. So that would be my take. I do think monthly board meetings are tough. Okay, so let's talk about assessment. Really, the last topic for the day. So assessment is really critical for accountability and improvement, and it involves individual board member assessment, board assessment, and ED assessment, executive director assessment. So let's talk about individual board member assessment first, and there's a sample board member self-assessment in the packet that you received. I think every year it's really important that board members self-assess whether this is the right place for them. And it's important for the governance committee to hold board members accountable for meeting the expectations that you have for them. What percentage of meetings are they attending? Are they attending committee meetings? Were there other participation or financial expectations that they are meeting or not meeting? And really having a conversation, whether a board member's term is up or not, at the end of each year about how they are doing in their role as a board member. Boards should assess themselves, I would say, at least every other year. And you'll find both a mini board self-assessment and what I call more of a major board self-assessment example in the materials that you received. But really making sure that the board understands its role and doing a survey to really get a sense as to whether the board understands its job as a board and what board members' jobs are is really important to growing the effectiveness of your board. And lastly, the ED, whether a professional or a volunteer, should be assessed on an annual basis based on the job description that should be in writing and any goals that were set for the coming year. Typically, that would be done by either the executive committee or a special committee for reviewing the executive director. Those are really the three types of assessment that can help your board continue to evolve and grow. Questions about assessment? So let's talk about what makes a great village board. Really, it's a board that displays passion and preparation, right? Passion for the mission and a commitment to prepare and attend and be engaged in board meetings and board activities. And a board that is accountable to each other and appreciative to volunteers, donors, and staff. I think those are the two elements that make for a great village board, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions anybody has.
Want to let you know that the chat function is indeed working right now. So if people are reticent to speak up, they can just type.
Finally.
Yes, it's working.
Well, again, my email is michael@capacitypartners.com. If you have questions, feel free to email me. If you'd like us to speak with your board about any one of these issues or do part of this presentation for your whole board, Rave is providing for that. And we would look forward to helping you out. Yes, Barbara.
I was distracted and I missed I missed what you said about a great village board. I got the passion for the mission and the preparation for meetings and engagement, but could you just go over it again?
Sure. You got the first part. The second part was being accountable to each other and the public trust, and being appreciative to volunteers, donors, and staff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to also just note there was a question that was directed at me specifically, but is relevant to you all. Anyone that registered to this training should see in their inbox, actually 2 emails from this morning. One contains the PowerPoint presentation. The other is a document that Michael had kindly generated to provide kind of an overview for board documents and functions. It's quite extensive. And so if you haven't registered and joined in, do let me know so that I can send you the information directly and so that we don't miss anybody. Also wanted just to thank Michael for a second round of board development. I see a hand up so I can continue it afterwards. Go ahead, William.
Michael, I've got sort of an overriding, it's not really an issue, but a concern. I mean, I've served on a number of boards, you just call them national organizations. And now I'm dealing with a board, you know, just community association. And I'm thinking to myself, this board is so far from where you are. You know, and the idea of saying to my fellow board members, gee, you know, we don't have a whistleblower policy in effect. And I'll be met with hysterical laughter. I mean, and I guess you would call it an operational board, and we put on lots of events. We don't really have a structure. There's no formal way of selecting board members. Yeah, it's every month we get together and we review. We have a budget, we have money, and we put on events for the community. And I'm just a little concerned there's going to be, you know, just a strong negative reaction to what we need to do to comply with Oxley-Sarbanes, for example. I'm just sort of thinking or at least other board members are going to be overwhelmed, and this is not what people signed up to do.
Yeah, so I would suggest that your board governance is a journey. And you're at the beginning of that journey in the way your board is operating. And the idea would be, what steps can we take to more formalize how we operate and sustain our village goals? You're not going to go from 0 to 100 in a day or a year, but you can prioritize different steps to make your board more effective. That would be my take. I don't think that you're going to get there in one shot. And frankly, you probably don't have a whole lot of, or any staff, and you probably don't have a whole lot of documents to worry about destroying, right? So let's focus on what's important first, and that might be, how do we make sure that our meetings are effective and we have the right people on our board and we have a way to sustain this organization? So many village boards are struggling with just finding board members and finding somebody who's willing to be the board chair. And so I would suggest starting from the beginning and working your way towards a more effective operation that can sustain the programming and the mission that you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Sure.
William, what village are you with?
William, what village are you with?
Beck,
Yeah,
North Chevy Chase.
Okay,
I think I have a call with you all coming up.
thank you for joining.
Paula,
Yeah, I'm not sure if this question is for Michael or for Pazit. Michael, you've referenced several sample documents that we received. Did we receive them? The folks who were on this session? Is that in the email that you mentioned?
As I've said, if you have registered, and I think I can check to see if you're listed, Paula.
I am.
You should see in your inbox a couple of
Okay.
emails from me
Yeah,
this morning.
so you received in your email this document that says governance overview villages of Montgomery County.
Okay,
And so it has the detail of everything I covered today, and then there's an appendix with sample documents in the back of it.
great. Okay, I'll check my email. Sorry if I overlooked it.
No worries.
I also want to kind of reference what William had alluded to, because that was feedback I've gotten from the previous session. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there's a lot of information that had been provided to you today in this session, and that some of it is more relevant than other parts of it. And so just take what you feel is most pertinent, most helpful to you. And in the follow-up session with Michael, you can choose to zoom in to focus on the aspects that you think would be most effective as you move forward with your village and your sustainability. So take whatever you need. I mean, like anything in village life, you get lots of perspectives, ideas, best practices, you take it all in, and then you make use of whatever you find most relevant.
I think there's also a wonderful opportunity to benefit from the different villages that are at different stages, and learning from each other how to move your village forward based on the villages that are further ahead right now and how they are structured and staffed.
I had a question.
Sure, Linda.
I was busy thinking and writing when you were talking about one of the newer ways to think about committees that only had 3. And I got internal affairs, external affairs, but I missed the third one.
Governance.
Oh, okay. I thought those committees were under governance.
No, those
And I got it. Thank you.
no problem.
Couple
Paula?
more, yeah.
I'm sorry, and another question related to that, internal, external governance. If you think about the functions that many or most or all of our villages provide, things like rides, programming, maybe some home repair tasks, those would all fall under external, correct?
Well, I actually think that
internal.
would fall under operations. And again, right, so you might have a program, right? In other words, if you have a program committee now, that might fall under your internal, affairs committee.
Okay.
Typically, though, that is not a board governance function, right? That would be something that would come under your staff if you have staff, or an operations committee, which you might want to keep separate if your village is not quite as far along.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to say a few more things, and if people have no more specific questions. So some of you might have missed the intro that this board development session is a part of an ongoing investment in villages in Montgomery County sustainability and growth. We have 2 key components for this long-term plan. One is board development, both in the form of this seminar as well as follow-up ongoing session with Michael. So if you're a part of a village board that would like to have a session with Michael, he offers 90 minutes with you all to provide sort of more tailored advice and consult specific to your needs. If your village's total budget is more than $50,000, you are asked to put some skin in the game, and your cost to this would be $200. Otherwise, everything is free. In addition to board development, Michael is also offering to villages that feel like they are in that place of their growth and interest to invest in strategic planning session. That is also something we can help participate financially with. So if you're interested in that, please contact Michael and then we'll figure out the finances of how to pay for that, because we are helping with that cost as well. And this project will continue on into the next FY, because we are very invested in you all's ability to have vibrant, strong villages that are there for the long run. Any kind of additional workshops or topics, please put them in the chat box. I saw a couple of questions about volunteer engagement. It so happened that the Washington Area Villages Exchange just had such a session, and I think it was recorded, so contacting them would be also wonderful. But we will continue to explore different workshops on different topics and bring experts on either liability concerns, on volunteer nourishment, or any other topic you would like. Additionally, you will get an email seeking your feedback. It's very short evaluation form. I would greatly appreciate it if you filled that out so that we get some input on how to take things, how to improve things in the future. Many of you have not met me, so I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Pazit Aviv, and I'm the village coordinator for Montgomery County. My role is to support each and every one of you and all your villages as you go about the important business of helping older adult age in the community, whether it is just focusing on aging or from intergenerational perspective. And I've put my email in the chat box so that anyone interested in having a conversation, you are strongly welcome and encouraged to contact me, and I will do my best to help you. So I see Joe had mentioned liability, and so that topic also came up in the in-person session. I will talk to Wave, Mary Jo, to see if they would like to partner or in a refresh on liability concern for villages, a second look, third look for those of you who have joined the conversation later on, because we had several such sessions before, but it's always good to check it and ask those questions again. So I will follow up on that, Joe. And that's it for me. So if we have no additional questions or concerns, we can adjourn for now.
Well, thank you all, and I look forward to continuing to work with villages who are interested, and I think you guys are doing amazing work in our county.
And thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.